gets a copy of this book. Mildred, I see you have yours. Who does not have a copy of the class book? Brother Bill, they're right there with you. Okay. Okay. Gina, would you like to have one to follow along with? Sure. That next one, sure. That'll be a little easier. I'm glad to see Betty Bailey here tonight. Glad she's here. She had a fall, and she is still very sore. If you hug her, be gentle. She's really sore. The ribs were not broken, but they are bruised. So bear that in mind. Okay. I don't think I need to do a whole lot of lead into the study tonight. This is going to be an introduction. And we are at different points in our knowledge, perhaps, I'm sure that's right, regarding the topic of premillennialism. And like any subject that so much has been said and written about and talked about, you're not going to cover all of it, and you sure won't answer all the questions just in one session. In fact, you won't do that in several sessions. But what Jeff Archer has done in the class book is to try to set forth in an understandable way, just starting on an introductory level, defining our terms, and then going from there to see what is taught on this and what the Bible says. You never do anybody a favor. You don't do yourself a favor or anyone you might be trying to teach if you misrepresent them. And so our purpose is not to misrepresent. In fact, we're going to try to be very careful not to. And what Jeff does when he quotes from people like Tim LaHaye, for example, or Hal Lindsey, these names are household names associated with the doctrine. And so when you see a statement in context about some aspect of this teaching from these men, it's not to slander somebody, it's just to say this is representative. This is, instead of you trying to put in your words what they say, it's here's what they say. So again, in the course of this, we're going to be revisiting things that should be part of our knowledge, but we need to revisit them. We'll be talking about the Abrahamic promises. We'll be seeing how those Abrahamic promises were fulfilled. We'll be looking at other biblical prophecies. We'll be looking at prophecies about the kingdom and how those prophecies were fulfilled. We'll be looking at the nature of the kingdom. And we'll be looking at a lot of passages, again, in context in the course of our study. So I do have several PowerPoint slides, and I'm following closely what your lesson book in your hands will be doing. But it is a class, and therefore if you have a question or if you want to make an observation, make a point as we go along, then by all means I want you to feel free to do that. I trust you do feel free to do that. And let me start out this way. Is there anybody in here who has not heard of the Left Behind series? If you've never heard of the Left Behind series of books or some of the movies on that or the PC games, you've never heard of Left Behind, would you raise your hand? Anybody? Amber, you've not heard of that? Pardon me? Okay, there's two. Well, I mean, that's not a right or wrong answer. I just wanted to know. Here's the reality. The Left Behind series, you think, well, what's that talking about? Well, the idea of left behind is that here people are raptured up, and guess where everybody else is? Well, they're left behind. And in this series, what the authors did was to use fiction. In other words, it'd be, like Tom and Susie or whatever. I don't know but they'd make up names and just tell about what happens and narrate different things. And they were using, and it says in the beginning it's fiction, but they were using fictional characters and situations to teach the premillennial doctrine. And they did it very effectively. So that's what it's about. I don't have the statistics right now, but earlier, some years ago, I was reading how many copies of those books, and I say the books because it was a series of installments, but how many had been purchased. I mean, it was in the millions. And then I was reading the pre-publication sales, before the next installment would be out, how many had already been sold as pre-publication sales. And it was amazing. There are people here tonight that were involved in a home study that we had here locally with someone who, one of the questions she asked was, have you read Left Behind? And I said, no, I know what you're talking about, but I have not read that yet. And she said, oh, I have. She said, it's just fascinating. And I said, well, here's what it's doing. But anyway, in the course of the studies, if you were to say, turn to the book of Acts, and I'm not, this doesn't matter, because you can take anybody just wherever they are and teach them starting right there. But where she was, if you said turn to the book of Acts, she'd have to look at the table of contents. She couldn't find the book of Acts, which that whole book, what it's about, as you know, is answering the question, what must I do to be saved? It's giving cases of conversion. It's showing what people did. With the result, they were added by the Lord to His church. It's dealing with the most fundamental kind of things we need to know about. And I just say that to illustrate that a lot of people will read books like the Left Behind series and be avid readers and know all about that, but they don't know what to do to be saved. They don't know where the book of Acts is and what it's about. And instead of that being an aberration, instead of that being an anomaly, that's just one of those weird things, that happens out in California. The truth of the matter is, what we're talking about is something that almost all of our religious neighbors and friends believe. It's one of the most widespread doctrines. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And as I say, our aim is not to misrepresent, but it is to properly represent concepts, doctrines, and go to the Word of God to see what the Scriptures say. What I want to accomplish, as far as objectives I have in this, as Brother Reese and I will be dealing with this topic, I want you to have a better understanding of what this is and what the Bible teaches, but I also want us to be better equipped to help someone who is seeking for truth. And so that's where I'm coming from. It's not to make somebody look silly or make us look good, but it's to equip us and help in our understanding and to help us to help others. Sir.
Just as a coincidence, as you bring it up, before we even talk about going over this book, most of the young men had their game consoles. Thomas has one too. It became tricky, and we were looking at this particular game, something we might do together. And the title of it was Just Us. And he said, this story about a man and his daughter, and they're trapped, trying to get away from this and that. And we looked at it further, and it was a direct offshoot from that. And Thomas had said, I've read that, it's one of the #1 sellers. And then when we got to looking at it, realizing it was just an offshoot of the Left Behind series.
And this was a computer game?
Yes, sir. And,
Yeah.
without, even the advertising
Jeff mentions in the first paragraph that the series has inspired 2 PC games. He makes the point as of 2007. Now we're already in 2015, but he was saying as of 2007 that the books authored by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins had sold 65 million copies. Oh, and it says the 16 books. I said a while ago I didn't remember how many there were. 16 books in the Left Behind series. So 65 million copies. PC games, action thrillers. And that's, as he says, this is one example of the hugely popular doctrine of premillennialism. In other words, that's not all of it. That's just a current example of the widespread propagation of it and the appetite to read that or to play it on a computer game or whatever that might be. By the way, I need to say this in the passing. I don't know that I have anything much by Jerry Jenkins, but that Tim LaHaye, he has really done some good work. He has done some good writing on the family. He's done some good writing on a lot of things, like I think he's the author of one book I have, which is called Anger is a Choice. It's just a really good book. And so he's done a lot of good writing on other things that are useful. And so I do want to mention that. But you have various, for illustration purposes, groups mentioned, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, most all of the Baptist denomination, the Worldwide Church of God, the Mormons, others teach premillennialism as part of their doctrine. The truth of the matter is, as far as denominationalism is concerned, the Lutheran Church is about the only denomination I know of, personally, in the denominational world that does not teach premillennialism. And they kind of stand alone in that way. But another example Jeff gives, you get into study Bibles, and you think, well, a study Bible is a good thing. And you look at the notes, and so the notes can be helpful. But he does mention that some of those study Bibles, such as the Schofield Study Bible, the Ryrie Study Bible, and some others, actually teach premillennialism within their notes. So, I mean, you don't think about, when you purchase a study Bible, you don't think, well, I better watch this. But the reality is that sometimes in the study notes, there can be error taught there. But those that he mentions in particular advocate premillennialism. Okay. Any questions so far? Well, do you think we ought to define our terms? Millennialism. Postmillennialism, amillennialism, premillennialism. What in the world does all of that mean? The concept of postmillennialism is, and you may say, well, I've never heard of that. Has anybody ever heard of postmillennialism? Okay, a few of you have. See, what you have here is a millennial reign. The milli part is Latin for 1,000. The anna part, or annus part, is year. And so the idea is a 1,000-year reign. So you have that coming, and then after that, the return of Jesus. So, in other words, what does that mean? Well, that means you've got this 1,000 years of utopia on earth, where the kingdom has come, and you've got utopia on earth, and then at the end of that time, the king comes. That is not commonly held anymore. But in the 1800s, it was commonly taught. Alexander Campbell, the first paper that he put out, that he edited, was called The Christian Baptist. Does anybody know what the second paper he put out was called? The Millennial Harbinger. Millennial Harbinger. What's that mean? He's advocating the millennium. But he was a post-millennialist. And so that's just one example of a well-known preacher that advocated that. An amillennialist simply is one who does not believe the Bible teaches there's going to be a 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. But then premillennial means you have Jesus returning, his coming to earth, and reigning on earth for 1,000 years. Now that really is where we're at. That's what, if you say, well, I don't even know what the word means. Well, the pre part, affixing pre to millennialism, is simply saying Jesus comes first. Then you got the 1,000-year reign. That's all that means. He comes first, he sets up his kingdom on earth, he reigns on earth for 1,000 years. So that's what the word means. The word itself is, millennialism has to do with 1,000 years. The pre part is getting Jesus coming to earth first, then setting up his kingdom, reigning for 1,000 years. Okay, so does everybody understand our definitions? So now you could put in your own words what a post-millennialist is, what an amillennialist is, and what a premillennialist is. Correct? Correct? All right. Again, postmillennialism. Jesus will return after a 1,000-year era of peace on earth. This chart was put together by David Padfield. Does anybody know David Padfield? He preaches up in Zion, Illinois. Has a very good website, by the way. And he makes the point that after World War II, that, historically, that this doctrine no longer was taught very much. Have you ever noticed that that's kind of the way doctrines kind of come and go? They'll be taught for a while, and then they die out, and then they're revived again, that kind of thing. That sometimes is what happens. But instead of it being like, the time's going to come that it's really going to get better on earth, actually Paul told Timothy, evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So the Bible doesn't anticipate a time on earth where there's going to be a 1,000-year period of utopia. Again, premillennialism, just breaking the word down, prefix meaning before, milli 1,000, annum is years, and ism, of course, on the end of it, that's a doctrine or theory. So the belief that Christ's second coming will precede a literal 1,000-year kingdom on this earth. One of the more helpful scholars, Bible students, that I've read after is Irvin Jensen. And he wrote a book on inductive Bible study. He is just, to me, he's a master at taking a book and getting an overview of it, seeing main points, keywords, analysis. He's really, really, really good. He also is premillennial. And I have charts that back when we were in Lexington, before moving here, I purchased some charts that he put together, and some really good charts. And this was one that until today I never had pulled out. These were perforated, where you can pull the charts out and make copies. This is back in the days, Hank, of the overhead projector. That's what these were for. Now you could just, burn it with burn it onto the film and use it that way. And they had a few that were already in color. And so I scanned this today to put it in. But again, he's showing, you got the pre-incarnate Christ, and then you got Genesis 1, the creation, and the Old Testament period, then Jesus coming, and his work here, and then his ascension back into heaven. And now we have what premillennialists call the church age. They're saying we're not in the kingdom age, that right now we're in the church age. They make a distinction between the church and the kingdom. So a premillennialist will say Jesus is not reigning on God's throne right now. They will say Jesus is not king right now. that in this interim, that we're in the gap period. And in this gap period, that the church exists. I'm fairly just stating what they believe. But then, after that, with this coming of Christ to earth, you have what Jensen's calling the millennial age, and the new creation, and then eternity future. So this kind of thing is widely taught pretty well on every hand. Now, what the first thing that I found intriguing, are you with me on page 6 there? What that chart right here is doing, this is not trying to chart out everything about premillennialism. The chart at the top of page 6, all that is doing is taking the book that we have just covered. It's taking the book of Revelation, and it's showing chapters of Revelation related to history. And so what you've got, when you look at that arrow that points up, the resurrection of Christ, then you got Revelation 1. And so this is the church age, where you've got chapters 2 and 3, the letters to the churches. And then the premillennial idea is that in Revelation, next you've got in chapter 4 and following, you've got the rapture, where the saints are raptured up. And you got this period of tribulation on earth in chapters 6 through 19. And at the end of 19, you've got the second coming, and then the kingdom for 1,000 years in chapter 20. And then you've got the final judgment where they put Revelation 22 and 21-22. Again, this is a chart from Hal Lindsey's book, There's a New World Coming, page 18. So what Jeff did is just copy that right onto that. So that's using the structure that's making Revelation, structuring it to fit in with premillennialism. Getting the rapture in there. I mean, never mind that the book says nothing about the rapture. It says nothing about that. But anyway, that's the one that's so widely read has the rapture coming, and the kingdom on earth coming in chapter 20. Meanwhile, all of these seals being opened, and the trumpets sounding, and the bowls of wrath being poured out. It's like, well, you don't have the children of God on earth then anyway. They've been taken up into heaven, and all this is taking place to punish the lost on the earth. The truth of the matter is, all those chapters were describing a real struggle Christians would be having, living in the world with pressure to engage in imperial cult worship, to bow down and say Caesar is Lord, and could not buy or sell if they did not do so, and those kind of things. But again, tonight we're just trying to introduce it. But what I started to say is that right below that, in your first paragraph below that chart, Jeff acknowledges there are many types of premillennial doctrines. But he says this study focuses on dispensational premillennialism. Now, we sometimes use the word dispensation. We talk about these time periods where God has dealt with man. And so we understand there was the patriarchal dispensation and the Mosaic dispensation. And now we are in the Christian dispensation, the gospel age, what the Old Testament foretold as the last days. So we're familiar with the term dispensation. But what Jeff says is that this doctrine divides history of the world into 7 periods or dispensations, with number 7 being the millennial reign. Now, it's not like, and by the way, Jeff doesn't even mention what the 7 dispensations are. He just says there are 7 dispensations, and then he just skipped to number 7 because he said number 7 is the premillennial reign, the last period. And then he gives several features of this doctrine, and then you've got just a couple of questions on your part, and that's all there is to this introduction. I'm not asking you to memorize these 7 periods, but I thought, well, I want to know what this is. What are these 7 periods? And so today, I did a little research, and in written form and in a DVD from a teacher that advocates this, as well as from the Tim LaHaye book, I found each one naming exactly these same 7 dispensations. So for what it's worth, I'm going to include that just so you'll know. Jeff doesn't go into this here, but just so you'll have that. Here are the 7 dispensations. Now, as I say, you're familiar with taking the Bible and seeing in the beginning God is speaking directly to Adam. He speaks directly, in the time of Cain and Abel. He speaks directly to Noah. And in the broader sense, that's the patriarchal age begins with Adam. Even though sometimes we make a distinction, talk about the call of Abraham, but broadly speaking, it's going to be from creation down to Mount Sinai. Would you agree when we think of the patriarchal dispensation? So the revelation that is oral, God speaks to the heads of the households, they reveal His word. So you're familiar with that. But now to understand what they're saying, and that's my purpose, I want to understand somebody's point of view and then go from there. But they're saying, no, there are actually 7 dispensations. So it's kind of like you've got to relearn and understand what they're talking about. So number 1 is innocence. Now, I've never thought about calling innocence a dispensation, but what they say about that is, now that's the period when Adam and Eve were created in the garden. That's a state of innocence, and before sin enters the world. And so they're calling that a dispensation of time. And then number 2 is conscience. Now, all I'm doing here, this is not me doing this. This is directly from their materials. That's what they call it. Dispensation number 2 is conscience. So now, as a result of sin, man has knowledge of good and evil. So now there's that conscience. So that's dispensation number 2. Again, in what? In the Bible? No, it's dispensation number 2 in the doctrine that we're talking about. Then number 3, the dispensation is that of human government, civil government. And this is defined as judgment of men by men of men kind of thing, with the authority for capital punishment and everything else. And so this is beginning in the time of the flood, and it just continues on. And as I understand it, even to the time of the Babylonian captivity, you've got this dispensation kind of in an umbrella overarching that. Period number 4, or I should say dispensation number 4, is called the dispensation of promise. And this was given exclusively to Israel. This is the covenant with Abraham. Dispensation number 5 is law. Started at Sinai and ended at the cross. Dispensation number 6 starts at the cross. In other words, technically you'd say after the death of Jesus. But dispensation number 6 is called the dispensation of grace. In other words, the premillennialist would say we are living in the dispensation of grace right now. We're living in the church age. This is the dispensation of grace, not the kingdom age. And then as Jeff says, number 7, dispensation number 7 is the kingdom. So you've got supposedly the tribulation judgments, and so in other words, you've got the saints of God raptured up, the tribulation on earth. That period is a total of 7 years. Christ is back down to earth. He's reigning on earth in Jerusalem, literally in Jerusalem, in Israel, reigning there, setting up His kingdom, reigning there for 1,000 years. And then at the end of that time, there's final judgment and eternity. So what Jeff says just in a couple of sentences in the passing and does not elaborate, this right here is as I said, just when I read that, I thought, well, let me pursue that and see what does that mean, 7 dispensations. Now, here's the thing about it. If you read the Bible and came up with teaching that said there are 7 dispensations, then I'd say there's 7 dispensations. But is this what you get out of reading the Bible? I'll tell you, you have to have help It seems to me that there's a difference between taking material and making it simple. Jesus did that all the time. He'd take some profound teaching, make it so simple a child could understand it. That's what a good teacher does. But if you take something that's simple enough, it can be understood to start with. I mean, if you just lay it out and explain it, it's simple enough that people can understand it readily. But you take something like that, as I understand the true concept of the 3 dispensations are, and then you make it so mixed up and muddled that when you get through, nobody can understand it. You've not done anybody a big favor. So anyway, this is what Jeff is talking about, and what he says is that the last period, again in that paragraph, will be the millennial reign. In other words, we're not in the last period in this scheme of things. We're in the next to the last period. We're in the church age. But the last period is going to be the kingdom age, and then the end of time and eternity. So you see that, and what this is right here, this is from the book, Understanding God's Plan for the Ages. And this is one of those things that, where you have a book and it has a fold-out page. It's part of the book, but you fold out and it makes a long chart. That's what this is. But do you see that what this has? It's so much on the side and bottom and top and everything, but on the dispensations right here, again, what you got is number 1 is that innocence, number 2 is conscience, number 3 is civil government, number 4 is promise, number 5 is law, number 6 is grace, the church age, and number 7 is the millennial kingdom. You see that? So this is the same thing that I just showed you, except there's a chart with a lot of other stuff there with it. But by doing this, you see that we're not misrepresenting. This is his chart. This is Tim LaHaye's chart that shows these 7 dispensations. So that's all I'm going to say about that, unless there's a question. And again, we've already looked at that. Now, this really is a biblical approach, and this is at the bottom of page 7. The biblical approach has, of course, from the time of the beginning here and all of Old Testament history pointing forward to Jesus' death, crowned by the resurrection, his ascension into heaven. He had said, upon this rock I'll build my church. By the way, what did he say in that same sentence to Peter? I'll give unto you the keys of the kingdom. Does it make sense to you that Jesus is saying, I will build one thing, but I'll give you the keys to something else? Does that make sense? I'll build one thing, but now the keys are to altogether something else, not what I'm building. That makes no sense. You give the keys to the thing you're building. Upon this rock I will build my church. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So, the Spirit came, men spoke with other tongues, the gospel was preached, Acts 2, the church was established. Paul could write the Colossians in chapter 1 and verse 13. You need to know passages like this. Colossians 1:13. And he would give thanks to God who's delivered us from the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of God's dear Son. Those in the church at Colossae were translated into the kingdom of God's dear Son. So that's what the Bible teaches. And so what we're living in now is this period of the gospel age, and will continue until the time of the resurrection of all, and all will be before Jesus' throne and be judged by him, and then eternity will begin, heaven for the saved and hell for the lost. So that's a very simple representation of what the Bible actually teaches. But quickly, what Jeff points out is some of the features of premillennialism are that the promises made to Abraham have never been fulfilled. One of the men I was listening to today said that exact thing. He said the promises of Abraham were not fulfilled. They've not been fulfilled yet. The kingdom prophesied in the Old Testament, according to premillennialism, is literal and physical. Do you remember what Jesus said to Pilate? My kingdom is not of this world. According to the doctrine, Jesus came the first time to establish his kingdom, but he was rejected by the Jews, and so what he had to do, instead of establishing his kingdom, he's waiting, postponing that till he returns to the earth again, but to fill the gap, he established his church. That's the doctrine. But before Jesus returns to the earth, according to the doctrine, the Jews will reoccupy the land of promise. The Jewish nation will be reestablished, and all Jews will be converted. Jesus will return, but only in the air. The saints will be raptured up. Period of great tribulation. I mentioned this a while ago, 7 years, and then Jesus returns, this time to the earth. All the sinners are killed, the saints are victorious. And that's when the 1,000-year reign of Jesus begins, according to this theory. And the saints will not die during this period. Now, I have conflicting reports on that. This is right from Jeff. I was reading another, actually, he's already said this, that sometimes the doctrines will vary a little bit. But I was reading another source where someone said that no saint will die under the age of 100. But others are just saying they won't die during this period. So I guess it kind of depends. Then at the end of that time, you're going to have this battle of Gog. That's a typo there. Sorry about that. That should be Gog and Magog. And then the resurrection of the wicked and destruction of the earth, and final judgment will occur. And the saints will go to heaven. The sinners will go to hell. So all he is doing is, these are features of premillennial doctrine. I've just got a couple of minutes left, and I know we can't do it justice, but we've already mentioned the Left Behind series. Does anybody, and I'm just throwing this out for anybody, examples that you've seen of the premillennial doctrine? Anybody? Steve?
It's kind of far-reaching, but sometimes even when we look around us in the political realm and decisions that are made regarding governments of this earth, particularly Israel,
Yes.
that there's certain postures and positions taken that basically it's all rooted in the belief of premillennialism.
That is an excellent example. And what we should say is that whatever decision the U.S. makes, for example, about our relation to our ally, Israel, should be based upon principles of government and democracy and whatever like that, but not based upon the promises to Abraham, not based upon the land promises, and not based upon the concept of Jesus coming back there to reign. But that's exactly what is behind a lot of the policy and support for policy that is sometimes made. Good example. Yeah. When I look at this, what problems do you see with the premillennial doctrine? Here's the thing about it. Did any of you know James Bales? He was a prolific writer. Yeah, he was a prolific writer. It'd take me a long time to list the good books that he wrote. And he wrote a good one it's called Prophecy and Premillennialism. If you can get that, get it. Prophecy and Premillennialism by James D. Bales, B-A-L-E-S. And what he says in the first part of his book is that as he's dealing with the doctrine, that he's dealing with the fundamental problems and issues and showing what the Bible says. And he says it's like if you're cutting down a tree, if you need to cut down a tree. If you cut a tree down at its roots, all the way down at the roots where it's touching the ground, and you cut it there, what's going to happen to the tree? Well, the tree's going to fall. You know, you cut the tree down. It's not necessary for you to go up and clip every leaf and twig in the tree if you cut it down at the root. And so the thing is, instead of every little detail of the point, if we deal with the fundamental principles, the features that are herein opposed to biblical teaching, we'll be doing ourselves a favor to do that. I know we're out of time. If you have questions, make a notation of that. By the way, you got another page over here. You turn that, and you got a lot of room for notes. But make notes as we go. Ask questions as we go. And I know tonight was just kind of a quick introduction. I hope it was helpful to you. And we'll continue. Now, next Wednesday night is our singing night. But then, the Lord willing, the following Wednesday night, we'll resume with lesson number 2. Thank you.